Alright, good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting alchemical light. I got the figure laid in pretty solidly. I would like to render him a bit more. For the moment, though, I'm just going to play with some color on the surrounding edges, and then I'm going to drop in some red pretty much around his perimeter as a aura, sort of a fiery aura, and then drop in some alizarin crimson glaze, more thinly mixed, to blend that into this yellow a touch. And then I'm probably going to drop in some light blue up in here somewhere as some sky poking through. And then what's plotted for the rest of this is perhaps some emblemata, old emblemata symbols from the memory palace techniques of medieval speeches and or hermetic speeches. And then perhaps some symbols of alchemy with the alchemical monsters. I need to research some of them and figure out which ones stand for which before I launch into that, and then I'm going to kind of reimagine them, I think, and put a few of those in around this little landscape that seems to be developing right here. It just gives the impression of hills and distance to me, so I like them and play with that. But that's in the future. For the moment, just playing with some colors.
I became involved in the manufacture of execution equipment because I was concerned with the deplorable condition of the hardware that's in most of the state's prisons, which generally results in torture prior to death. A number of years ago, I was asked by a state to look at their electric chair. I was surprised at the condition of the equipment, and I indicated to them what changes should be made to bring the equipment up to the point of doing a humane execution. Beyond making recommendations for changes, I sat down on my own time and at my own expense and made a new design and new equipment available to the states utilizing electrocution at a price far lower than they would have to deal with if they hired an engineering firm to redesign a specific item. The equipment is all standardized. It all meets the current electrical requirements for electrocution. And the pricing is such that it's similar to what you pay for an off-the-shelf item, even though it's made up. They essentially pay for the parts, the labor, and the installation, and a 20% markup, which is more than fair. We are testing the electrocution system here at the Tennessee State Prison. This is connected to the execution system in place of the electric chair, and the system thinks that this is a human body. It consists of a series of heavy-duty resistors cooled by 4 fans. I will now switch on the fans and begin the cooling process. And then proceed with the power supply. We turn on the main circuit breaker. As you can see, the voltage has increased to 2640 volts. Begin the test at the control console for the electric chair. We turn the fail-safe system onto operation. Power up. Computer on. And I push the button for operation. The human body is not easy to destroy, and it's not easy to take a life, humanely and painlessly, without doing a great deal of damage to the individual's body. excess current cooks the tissue. There have been occasions where a great amount of current has been applied, and the meat actually will come off the executee's body like the meat coming off a cooked chicken. The execution must be conducted in 2 jolts. In 1/240th part of a second, the first jolt disrupts or destroys the individual's central nervous system. Current is then applied for a time approaching 1 minute. The adrenaline is being driven out into the bloodstream. The second jolt now seizes the pacemaker a second time. There's now no adrenaline left to restart the pacemaker. The person is dead. If the voltage does not exceed 2,000 volts throughout the execution, the individual's pacemaker is not permanently seized. In some 20 minutes, 30 minutes later, the individual's heart restarts itself on its own, and the person is now alive again. They would have to call all the witnesses back, strap the vegetable back into the chair, and re-electrocute him. There's no difference in a life support system and an execution system. The system has to function flawlessly for the time period that it's operating. With a life support system, if it doesn't function, the person dies. With an execution system, if it doesn't function flawlessly, the person lives. But he doesn't live as a human being. He lives as an injured, brain-dead vegetable, which is probably far worse than being executed. My father worked in the Massachusetts correctional system. He was a superintendent of transportation for many years, first at the old state prison in Charleston, and then at the new prison in Walpole, which has now since been renamed Cedar Junction. As many youngsters do, I went to work with him. I've been accompanying him to work since I was 4 years old. I visited all of the cell areas, including the death house. I was in the same room that people like Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in. I learned a number of things from the inmates that normally would be illegal, but have proved very useful to me in my later life. Things like picking locks and cracking safes, and I learned all kinds of strange things as a youngster. I came into the execution field from a backdoor standpoint because I was very concerned about the humanitarian aspects of death by torture, similar to what happened in the state of Florida 2 years ago with Mr. Jesse Tafaro, where they actually set the man's head on fire. Once the chair broke in half in the state of New York, and the individual lay writhing on the floor of the death chamber, crying for 35 or 40 minutes while the carpenters repaired the chair. They burnt the transformer up, and fortunately, due to the quick thinking of the prison electrician, they had some cabling. They ran wires over the prison wall and tapped into the outside power line. Without the consent of the power company, but there was no objection at a later time. And one execution where the transformer caught on fire and blew up. And it occurred in such a sequence that all it did was knock the individual unconscious. He came out of it with no apparent brain damage, no problem. 6 months later, they repaired the electric chair, and they did successfully execute him. But I mean, he was very lucky. He was hit with a full jolt of electricity. The equipment blew up, burned up, and he walked away from it without any damage, not even a burn. One by one, I determined that this state's equipment was not functional, this state's equipment was not functional. And then suddenly, one day I said, none of the equipment is functional. Many of the electric chairs were built by inmates and electricians who had no idea of what they were building. They took a picture of another state's electric chair and they made something that looked like it. Tennessee contacted me with the construction of their new prison. I was asked to inspect the equipment at the old facility and make a determination of what could be salvaged. The only consideration was that they wanted to maintain the electric chair, which they've had in place since 1898. The reasoning being that the wood from the electric chair not only had the tradition of all of their electrocution executions, but also formerly served as the wood of their gallows. The chair itself was much smaller than one would expect. It looked more like it was made to accommodate a youngster or a woman. So we essentially made the chair wider, we made the chair higher. We supplied them with a completely new power supply, so there's no excessive cooking. And then finally, because we were unable to match the old wood with the new oak, it became necessary for us to paint the chair with a special high-quality epoxy paint, the same basic paint that's used by NASA on the nose and body of the space shuttle.
That was back in '89, I believe it was. At that time, I was still in school. I just remember coming home. What is this big box in the front yard? Oh, it's an electric chair. Fred and my uncle were here. Come out with the crowbars. They had to break the box open, unscrew all the parts. There's an electric chair sitting in the front yard. Oh, it's very unusual. Something that I wasn't expecting. I guess Fred was expecting it. It's very difficult getting up and down those stairs with a couple 100-pound piece of oak chair. Well, of course, before we even brought it inside, I had to have Fred sit down and strap him in. I said no thanks.
I had processed a couple rolls of film, photos that I took for engineering purposes. Detail stuff, so you know how it looked before you took it apart. I went through it and I said, wait a minute, I went back, what the hell is this? We had a magnifier and we were trying to figure out what was there. We saw what appeared to be more than one image. far as I understand it, certain objects give off auras. And some objects that have been exposed to high intensity electromagnetic fields absorb some of that energy and give off an aura. I don't know what we photographed. We don't know if we photographed an entity. We don't know what's there. They still reside in Hartford and Tennessee. But when I told the sheriff, I maybe it was free. I don't know. That's assuming there was something in the start. Because of my work in drug diffusion, I was contacted by the state of New Jersey to consult with them on the construction of a lethal injection machine. They realized that lethal injection is a difficult, if not impossible, problem, even for trained medical personnel.
Now throw
They
some
determined that there should be some kind of
ivory
a
black
machine
into
that
some
could
phthalo
repetitively
blue.
deliver the necessary
Mix
chemicals
that up
at the proper
and
time
give a little depth
for all executions.
to some of the existing
This
shadows, but not
completely took
much.
the human factor out.
Let's see how we're doing on time.
I studied for several months, and I put together a proposal on how this machine should work. The syringe is driven by a weighted piston that floats on a column of air. This causes a push-pull relationship between the machine and the individual's vascular system, and it allows the executee to take the chemical at a rate that his body and vein will accept. The doctors were satisfied. Now they had to make the presentation to the prison officials. And the deputy commissioner was sitting there through most of the meeting, very bored. Probably because he didn't understand what I was talking about most of the time. But then he finally heard something he understood. One of the doctors said, Fred designed the helmet that's used on the electric chair in the state of North Carolina. At that point, the deputy commissioner said, stop the meeting. He looked at me and he says, you designed the helmet, the one that they just used? I says, yes. He said, okay, that does it. He turned around to the doctors and he says, do the necessary paperwork and see that Mr. Lucci gets the contract. Now, what lethal injection has to do with electrocution is beyond me. Simply because I'm capable of building an electric chair doesn't mean I'm capable of building a lethal injection machine. They're two totally different concepts. With electrocution, unconsciousness takes place in 1/240th part of a second. Gas chamber within 3 or 4 minutes. And with the gallows it doesn't matter because you're being dropped almost immediately after being brought onto the scaffold. None of the procedures require that somebody lay on a gurney for 35 minutes looking at a ceiling. You have to have the man immobile. He has to be unable to move or else he's going to move and damage his arm with a catheter. Which it certainly can make it more comfortable. You could put him in a contour chair like they have in the dentist's office, that at least he'd be sitting up. You could give him a television, you could give him music, you could put some pictures on the wall. Rather than put him in a concrete room. That's not humane. Essentially, the states talk with each other. We immediately got Illinois and we got Delaware. They had a hanging problem that they totally were not able to deal with. They had a gallows that had been stored for 25 or 30 years. They took it out and they screwed it together and it fell over. The only thing that was left that was functional were the hinges for the trap door. The reasoning here is that I built helmets for electric chairs, so now I can build lethal injection machines. I now build lethal injection machines, so I'm now competent to build a gallows. And since I'm building gallows, I'm also competent to work on gas chambers because I've done all of the other three. And what really makes you competent is the fact that you have the necessary background, you do the investigation, you find out what the problem is, and you solve it. It's not anything different than any competent engineer could do. The difference is that it's not a major market. are morally opposed to working on an execution. They think it's somehow going to change. As you probably guessed by now, I am a proponent of capital punishment. I'm certainly not a proponent of capital torture. We must always remember, and we must never forget, the fact that the person being executed is a human being. One of the things that I've had to deal with is the feelings of the people who are doing the executions. The guards that work with the execution equipment are generally the same guards that have dealt with that inmate for the last 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years while the man was on death row. The warden of the institution is in many respects the surrogate father of the inmate who's being executed. He sees that inmate maybe 5 or 6 times a week. He's concerned if the inmate is sick, if the inmate doesn't feel well, the general welfare of the inmate. And then at the end of the time, he must take that inmate out, strap him into his electric chair, strap him into his gas chamber, strap him into his lethal injection machine, or put a noose around his neck. Most people think of a hardened criminal and a murderer as someone who is in a cell and going to be executed, but these people are really no different than somebody that we work with every day. The only difference is that the inmate doesn't go home and the guard does. And now at the end of this 10 or 15 year cycle, they now are faced with the task of executing this man with equipment that's defective, with equipment that's going to cause pain. Even with a good execution, you get some burning at the electrodes. It's a very distasteful thing for the guard who has to unstrap the inmate from the electric chair after the execution. Normally, if we think of a belt with holes in it and a pin that goes through the holes, that guard has to then compress all the flesh and everything on the body. It's oozing because it's been cooked. He has to get the body fluids on his hands. With the equipment we design, all of the straps are instant release. They're the same as the safety belts in your car. You hit a button and the strap opens. Another thing that we do is that our electric chair contains a drip pan. All executees during the execution lose control of their bodily functions. They urinate and defecate in their pants on the chair. This normally winds up on the chair and on the floor directly beneath the chair. This is a disgusting thing when it occurs. It's a very inhumane thing to allow a person who's being executed, a human being, and who should be afforded the greatest dignity of all because he's losing his life. It's a disgusting and a degrading thing to allow him to defecate and, quite frankly, piss on the floor. Additionally, the urine, when it hits the floor, and I think everybody knows that urine is highly conductive, it's normally mocked up. If there's a second execution or a third execution, and this sometimes occurs where they have more than one execution at the same time, the guards in the death house now have to work and stand on a floor that's dampened and wet with this highly conductive urine. And fortunately, there's never been an accident, but it's quite possible for the urine to conduct the electricity and shock a guard. And nobody should have to place his life in jeopardy because an execution has been conducted. This is much the same thing that goes on with the gas chambers, with the